In this section, we're covering ICOs. This stands for initial coin offerings. We briefly mentioned it in the last section, but I think it's a very important section, that we want to pay a lot of attention to. A lot of you are probably here because of an ICO. They've been making the news a lot. There's been these huge capital raises. A lot of people are, kind of acutely aware that this might be a huge transition into a new way of funding companies. And we definitely want to spend a lot of time kind of addressing it and kind of clearing up any of the misinformation or kind of confusion surrounding it. Like I said, initial coin offering, it's a very interesting evolution of crowdfunding. You can kind of think of it like a Kickstarter for startups. What you'll have is a company who will issue tokens, and then they will sell a predefined amount of those to whoever wants to basically support them or their platform. And then they will take that fund and then they use it to fund their development or whatever they plan to do with that project. This is kind of an interesting way of doing it because most venture capitalists or angel investors, they'll invest $1 million, $2, $3 million into a company, and what ends up happening is they don't really have liquidity until the company either gets bought out or until they go public, and which that can normally be a fairly long road. Not always true. There are some ways that they can kind of get money out, but it's a kind of a long, arduous process, much more complicated. With ICOs, as soon as this coin is listed on an exchange and tradable, you have that immediate liquidity. That's why so many people are so interested in this, is if you get into an ICO early, you can make, in a week to 2, 3, 5x returns. That is kind of changing. That's something that we're going to be addressing, kind of the reasons why. Some do well, some do exceedingly well, some do not so well. I think there is kind of like this change in the marketplace currently. It goes into kind of that due diligence and that lasting, is this a bubble? Kind of, is this a good investment that we go into a lot more in the advanced course? But that liquidity factor is very interesting and something you should kind of understand about this ICO movement and why there's so much discussion about it. Another thing that's great is that you get this immediate consumer interest. Normally you'll have 2 to 3 people, maybe a group who are investing in your company, and then you have to go build these marketplaces. So many of these projects are community driven and they kind of need consumer adoption to be successful. ICOs, you get that immediate buy-in from the individual. If somebody has a stake, has some skin in the game, then they're going to kind of like really go out and they're going to want to preach the platform. They're going to share it with their friends because if it's successful, then they have basically an economic incentive to make it successful, because they will also be successful as well, being a token holder and having kind of a shared interest in that company. Like I said before, these are opportunities that were once only available to angels and VCs, but now it's kind of available to the masses. And I think that's why you have this large influx of individuals investing, and why you have these crazy valuations. Is normally, there's only a few people investing into it. They're very particular in who they invest into. They have a lot of due diligence, and now you have this kind of global market who just doesn't want to miss out on the next Google, who doesn't want to miss out on the next Apple. There's so much hype around this technology, but not a lot of understanding, and that is the main key of this course. We really want to clear up a lot of that. We want to help people get educated in this space, make kind of their best decision making that they can, and move forward in this space with a better understanding of it. So some ICO considerations. A lot of issues come with it because it isn't just as easy as being say hey, this is kind of the Kickstarter of crowdfunding. There's a lot of legal ramifications. If you're familiar with any of them, a lot of them come down to accredited investors. They don't want anyone to be able to invest into these, especially speculative assets, into these companies that might not necessarily be good investments. So that is kind of this legal hurdle, this legal gray area that we're currently dealing with. I think it is important to say that most of these tokens don't represent anything. I'll talk about it a little bit more in the next slide, but kind of, there's like the Howey test and the securities regulation, like far in the past, they kind of dealt with this, what defines a security. But basically, if a token is kind of represented as an underlying value or represents any underlying asset, then it's technically a security. And there's lots of hoops that have to be jumped through before you can kind of issue and trade and sell the security. So most companies are kind of dancing around that and hand waving around those requirements by saying that the token is not actually worth anything. So knowing that fact, you have to think that it's basically entirely driven by supply demand. It's basically a token that is based off of a company, but it really has no vested interest in that company's success, or failure. You want to, I think the first thing on the checklist, that should be very apparent to everybody, is that if an ICO is capped or uncapped, It's often the single most important factor when investing. You can think of it like if a company is trying to raise $20 million and there's $50 million in demand, they are going to basically sell that $20 million to investors, and then when the token is tradable, that additional $30 million in demand is going to try to buy it at an exchange. So you have a better chance of making a profit. If the ICO is uncapped, the converse is kind of true. We'll discuss that a little bit later in the next slide. I would generally say that you should try to get in early. This isn't necessarily the best way of going about doing that, however. I'll talk about that in a second, but as far as pre-sales, it basically gives you a guaranteed purchase. A lot of ICOs recently have been a huge trouble for people to get into because they've been dealing with the Ethereum network, and so you have a ton of people all trying to get into a finite amount of space, and it really is a struggle. You're basically massively DDoSing this system that wasn't ever intended for this many people spamming it all at once. So it's not necessarily the best outlet for all of this demand before the scaling issues are kind of resolved. But with a pre-sale, it's usually done through like a fairly centralized way. I'll talk about some of the few companies, Bitcoin Suite, and then also ICOH. There's a bunch of different companies that kind of handle this. And if you put your information in, if you kind of have an allotment, you can be guaranteed that you will get whatever money you sent them without having to deal with waiting in line, without having to deal with crowds, without having to try to spam the network to make sure that you get in before everyone else. That being said, there has been some issues with some ICOs kind of changing their terms, changing things after the fact. Maybe it was capped, maybe it was uncapped, and they've changed that after people's pre-sale has already gone in. So just be cognizant of that. Like if you are going to be buying in a pre-sale, make sure that you've done your research, your due diligence, that you kind of believe in the team that they're going to do what's right. Because if they change it afterwards, it's going to be very difficult to kind of have any remediation or deal with any of those issues going forward. Another thing is that a lot of these ICOs, to just get around the legal issue, they don't want to deal with it at all for the United States with the securities issues that I mentioned before. So they'll say that it's not available to anyone in the United States. That being said, a lot of people were like, hey, I'm just in crypto. Nobody's really checking. A lot of companies aren't doing their due diligence, and it's like I can send Ethereum to that company and invest, and it's not really a big deal. No one's checking. But what does happen is, say that company ends up scamming you or something ends up going wrong, you really have no recourse because you shouldn't have been participating in that ICO anyway. So just be aware of that. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of ways like workarounds for the legal requirements, but those kind of legal requirements are in place for a reason. And I do think that the SEC or some other governing body is probably going to step in fairly soon. So just be aware of kind of how that progresses. The most important thing, I think, is stay current with how to buy in. This space is so quickly evolving, especially because it's so new. I talked about some of the network congestion issues. A lot of companies wanted to do it just through the Ethereum network, but they realized that there was just too much demand and that not everyone could get in. It wasn't the most efficient way of doing that. So a lot of companies had these planned ICOs, and they completely changed their plan to try to resolve some of these issues. A good example is ICO. They were only taking pre-sale orders through Bitcoin Suite, and then the day before, I believe, the ICO, they ended up saying, oh, we're also going through ICOH, and it was on their Slack. So it's unless you got that announcement, you really had no way of knowing that. So you just have to stay very aware, because Bitcoin Suite was very much impacted. It was entirely sold out. I think they had $64 million of demand for $4 million of pre-sale allotment. But some individuals were able to get in through ICOH just because they were aware of what was going on in Slack. So like I said, just really try to immerse yourself in these communities, stay aware of where they're going and brief changes, because it could really financially benefit you. Like I said before, I'm going to go over just a few examples of ICO issues. Not going to necessarily say that it's good or bad, it's just something to be kind of aware of and a few examples that I want to highlight. As far as EOS, you can look into it a little bit more, but it kind of explicitly states, in their contract that EOS tokens have no rights, uses, or attributes. A lot of people were extremely upset about this. They were calling it a scam. They were saying it was ridiculous. Why would you invest in something that has no value? But like I said before, if you look at almost every other ICO, they don't really even have any utility on the platform. They really are completely useless with no rights, uses, or attributes. And like I said before, that is by design. It's so that it isn't an unlicensed security, and so they can kind of skirt that law and have that crowd raise. They kind of equate these tokens to just an API call. It's really valueless. How could you regulate that? Which I think is going to be an issue going forward, but currently it does work. So just be aware that if somebody's calling scam into the market, be very aware of that. But the crypto market is one of the quickest communities to kind of say scam and echo scam. So just be aware of who's calling it out and do a little research into why. There are a lot of scams. Be very wary, but then also don't kind of get caught up in the hype of what everyone's saying if it's not doesn't really have any basis for being true. Tezos, it just had a 2-week uncapped ICO and raised $232 million. Not really commenting on like the technical analysis of it. We actually go into that a lot in the advanced course. But what I will mention is that if you have a 2-week uncapped ICO and it raises that much money, where is the demand going to be for it when it launches on exchange initially? So that's just something to think about, right? If you're in it for a short-term play, if you want to dump it in a month and you want to double, triple, quadruple your money like everyone else is trying to do, but everyone is able to get in who wants to, there's not going to be a ton of buy side when it releases. In fact, it might dump, it might even out, but basically any kind of gain in the long term is going to be basically that long term, and it's going to be entirely based off of execution of the team. So if you fundamentally believe that Tezos is going to be the next Ethereum, it's going to be the next Bitcoin, it's a great time to get in. It's if you think it's interesting, if you think it's new, novel, and necessary in the space, definitely feel free to invest in something like that. But just be aware that it would probably be a long-term play, something like that. The short to medium term might not be that great as far as an ROI. Another example is going to be Bancor. They ended up raising $153 million. It was probably one of the most hyped ICOs, second probably only to Tezos this year. One of the more interesting things was, if you kind of read through, it basically said that it was capped. They had a hard cap set, but that it couldn't hit any of those caps for 1 hour. So it was basically a 1 hour uncapped ICO. And then what happened is when it started, they had some network issues. They said they were being DDoS, and they ended up changing that 1 hour to three hours because they wanted to make sure everyone got in. So rather than having that hard cap at $100 million, they ended up raising $153 million. And then rather than having it be a 1 hour uncapped, they ended up changing it to 3 hour uncapped. So just be aware of that. Like if there's like tons of demand, how they're kind of having their ICO go about, and kind of the issues that can take place after that. Just because there is so much going on, so many changes that can be made at the last minute, and just be aware of why are you investing in this. If it's for a quick flip, something like this could happen. Where they change the cap, and then there's a lot of people trying to get in, so it might not be that great of a play going forward. Some like positive things that I've seen in the ICO space, I think that there are just tons of growing pains because I don't think anyone really expected this level of demand. I'm just going to kind of discuss some of the positive things that I've seen in the space so far. Civic, I won't necessarily mention any of the things that are kind of happening currently. I know that there's a lot of stuff going on if you research. Don't really want to focus on that. I just kind of want to focus on their initial ICO. It had a cap of $33 million. They raised a majority of that during pre-sales, and then they mentioned that they would be able to refund a certain amount. I'm not going to like delve into the details of that. But then they also had an actual ICO like crowd sale. And what they did is they required the use of their app. So they're like an identity company, blockchain identity company. And so they had people install the app and actually verify their identity, and they had to do that to participate in the ICO. I really like that because one, it just gets the buy-in. It already gets that kind of, individuals onto their app and like actually using it and engaging in the community through this crowd sale, which is what I think is so interesting about ICOs in general, is just building that community, kind of getting that consumer buy-in immediately. And I think they did a really good job of going about and doing that. And then when it came time to actually purchase, and like be into the ICO, you basically confirmed your information. They had a very novel new security requirement where you had to kind of like turn a bird like right side up, so that bots couldn't really pre-program for that. It was generally unknown before. And then you confirmed your identity, and then it gave you a random assignment in line. So say even if you had 1,000 accounts, you weren't guaranteed to be the first 1,000. Say you had like a bot set up, you couldn't set anything up like that. So I think they did a very good job of trying to make it as fair as possible and not just letting large whales kind of accumulate all of the coins initially, which is the biggest thing right now. Most of these ICO companies, most of these crypto companies really want a community. They want people with skin in the game. So you'll see this kind of like iterations and changes and evolutions of ICOs to better have that happen rather than 8 to 10 people who kind of accumulate all of the coins. And I thought it was very interesting how Civic kind of addressed it. It'll be interesting to see how ICOs do in the future. Omise Go, they ended up raising $19 million entirely through a pre-sale. They didn't even do an ICO. Some people were a little resentful through that. Some people weren't very happy about it. But I think given the current climate where there were so many issues, where there's so many problems with these ICOs, there was so much, issues with using Ethereum to crowdfund things. I think it was kind of a very interesting decision. And I think that it ended up going well. It went kind of as smoothly as possible. I also think that it was capped at $19 million, and it was a relatively small raise, for the space. It's all in perspective. That it was a reasonable kind of ask. I do tend to use the rule of around $30 to $50 million is kind of the max of a reasonable ask that you'd want to kind of see at a startup in this space. Obviously that's still kind of an absurd valuation, but kind of in the research that I've done, much more than that you really can't responsibly spend. You shouldn't see these ICOs kind of asking for much more than that, where it just kind of gets greedy. Now, obviously, that's not a hard set rule. There are some projects in the space that require more capital raise. There are some that can utilize that in a responsible way. But it comes down to if they lock that in, if they have a release on a milestone basis, if they have some kind of incentive to continue working. There's a lot of kind of considerations that need to be made when you're analyzing these big raised companies. We go into that very much in depth. There's a huge section of ICOs in the advanced course because that is such an emphasis in the market currently. But just in general, kind of think of that. How much money does a company need to do what they need to do, and does it make sense for the roadmap that they're kind of talking about or discussing, or that you see in their white paper?